Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. Climate change has returned to the headlines in a big way. A number of recent reports have made clear that global warming is no longer a problem on the near horizon. It's here now, and its impact is profound. My very distinguished guest this week is Dr. Michael Oppenheimer. He's a professor of Geosciences and International Affairs at Princeton and is one of our foremost experts on climate change. We'll talk about recent developments and what can and should be done about them. Michael, welcome.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you for being here on my very first show. I appreciate it.
That's great.
So, these recent reports have caused a stir in climate circles, and you were the co-author of one of the main ones, and this was a report from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
That's correct.
And, the findings were pretty ominous, frankly. So tell us what that was about.
They were, and we get a lot of reports on this subject, but what's new about this one is that we've moved from a time when we're talking about projected changes in the future to a time when we can actually say things are happening that are affecting human beings. And I'll cite just two which struck me as particularly important. Crop yields, which have been growing for decades at 5 or 10% per decade and have to do so to meet the growing demand from a growing population and from the fact that countries like China are eating up the food chain. That is, they're going from eating grains to eating cattle, right, and the cattle eat the grains, and that's less efficient. That means there's a constant need to increase crop yields, and we've been able to do that since the Green Revolution. Unfortunately, it looks now like climate change has already, not in the future, but already started to create a headwind against those grains and cut into the growth.
Now, this is maybe counterintuitive because people, I think, tend to believe that warmer weather will yield,
Right,
a more robust crop or whatever. So why are you seeing a reversal in crop yields?
It's true up to a point that higher temperatures are good for some of the key crops. And here I'm talking wheat, corn, soybeans, for instance. But after a temperature that's somewhere, I'm going to use Celsius, that's all I have in my head. I'm sorry, I apologize. I know nobody out there understands it, but 25 or 30 degrees Celsius, you start getting a turnover where the crop yields actually start declining. And that is actually starting to happen in some areas. Now, there are still gains. Crop yields on the whole are still growing, but more slowly. And in some places, particularly Europe, the gains have stopped altogether. This bodes poorly for the future. Americans, by and large, are going to have enough food, at least for the next 50, 75 years. If it really keeps warming, we don't know what's going to happen. But we'll buy the food at higher prices because there'll be less of it, and other people are going to starve or be malnourished.
Now, we're seeing other effects as well. I mean, we're seeing wildfires. We're seeing April, I just heard, this past April has been the warmest April on record, or tied for the warmest April on record, right, for the entire planet. We're seeing these intense rain events and that sort of thing. So talk about some of the things that we're actually seeing right now.
Well, one thing that jumped out in this report, which again isn't just a matter of seeing a physical change in the climate, but it's affecting people, is that death rates from excess heat have increased. You know, heat waves kill people, and it even happens here in New York. The last killer heat wave was back around 1999, but there are always some deaths in heat waves. In the Midwest, there was a heat wave about 20 years ago, which killed about 1,000 people. And in Europe in 2003, where they have less air conditioning, there was a heat wave that killed 40,000 people. So this is no small matter. And the frequency of excess heat, those really terrible days, which in New York are 95 and above, for instance, the frequency of those days across the US, across the world, they are increasing, matched by fewer cold days. But people tend to die more in hot weather than are saved by less cold weather.
Right. Now, I should answer this question, but I'll ask you. Why, when you have these terrible events, like, tremendous numbers of deaths from heat waves and that sort of thing, other terrific effects from climate change, why doesn't that get more coverage in the popular press and the media?
You're a journalist.
I'm the interviewer.
There are many different theories about that. I think at the base of it is that people with a problem that's been abstract, which was mostly talked about as if it's a long way in the future, before recently when things are really starting to happen. People, we have a lot of burdens in life. You get up in the morning, do you have a job? Because unemployment is high. Do you have health insurance? Because until recently that situation, and it's still sort of fraught in some ways. Are your kids going to be able to afford to go, can you afford to send your kids to college? Just the whole litany. And then you go to the newspaper. You want to read about Putin? Do you want to read about Iran maybe developing a nuclear weapon? Do you want to read about Ukraine? Pick your poison. And
Right.
I think people just decide to shut some things out because there is what the psychologists call a finite capacity for worry. And we just can't handle it. I can't handle all of it. I pick up the newspaper and I don't want to read some of those bad stories. Global warming, I got to read about that. That's
Right.
my job. Other people, they're going to push it away. But in addition, I have to say the political polarization in this country is very unhelpful. It means that people who ordinarily might listen to scientific information are closed to it because the implications, namely that governments have to do something, don't align with their political and cultural biases. And I think that at the root of it is the biggest part of the problem.
Now, a couple of the recent reports had to do with the apparently unstoppable melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet. Say that 2 or 3 times fast. Why should we be paying such attention to that? Why is that such a big deal?
Global warming makes ice melt, and ice, say in mountain glaciers, has been pouring into the ocean, raising sea level. Global warming makes the oceans warm, and fluids expand when they're warmed. They take up more volume, so the ocean is expanding for that reason too. And the biggest amount of fresh water on Earth is tied up in the Antarctic ice sheet, and that has started to melt too, as has the big ice sheet in Greenland. These are all causing sea level to rise, and sea level has risen by and large due to the warming, about 8 inches globally and about a foot in the New York area. And you made it, a foot, what's the difference? Well, on a typical East Coast beach, the sea rises 1 foot vertically. It takes away 100 feet horizontally through submergence and erosion. And that's already cost us a lot of money just to keep our beaches going. It means houses go into the drink when storms come along like Sandy. There's been a calculation, an estimate, that if Sandy had come along at the beginning of, say, the year 1900, there would have been about 50,000 fewer buildings flooded than happened because it came along today. Even the same size storm, simply because the sea level has been getting higher. And the projections are now that mostly due to the ice sheet contribution, which is going to be growing, we're going to have a higher and higher sea level in the future. It's going to accelerate. And the findings from Antarctica confirm that this is a problem that not only is going to accelerate, but could get out of control.
So, scientists and you specifically have been warning for a long time about sea level rise that's a result of warming, because warming expands, heat expands water.
Right.
And then the mountain glaciers melting, so that contributes to sea level rise. And then you've been making projections based on that sort of thing.
Right.
Did those projections include the melting of the ice sheet in Antarctica, or is this a new added attraction, so to speak?
It's not new in that we've known about the risk for several decades. What's new now is we have, over the last 20 years, a much improved understanding of what the ice is doing and what it will do if we keep pushing it with the higher temperatures. We still don't have a good model that can really project what's going to happen, and that's why some of the statements around about this is going to be irreversible. Well, it's a risk, but we're not sure. We can't say that's 100% sure. But what's really troubling is that the sea level rise, which used to be dominated by the thermal expansion, the expansion of the warming water, is now, a third of it is due to this ice sheet component, a third of it is due to the thermal expansion, a third of it is due to mountain glaciers, and the ice sheet component is accelerating. And that's the part that's kind of unlimited, in the sense that if you really start to eat into Antarctica, there are 57 meters, about 200 feet worth of sea level rise, and we don't want to go there. So what this new study showed is that a portion of Antarctica, a portion that's got about 12 feet equivalent of sea level, is at risk of just destabilizing and relatively rapidly, not overnight, really over centuries, going into the sea. But even if it takes several centuries, it means sea level rising 3-5 times faster than it has in the past. And that's a rate we can't deal with. What are we going to do with New York City?
So take this ordinary family, for example, that you spoke about. They've got to worry about, the family income, sending kids to school, blah, 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 that sort of thing. Why should they specifically be concerned about sea level rise? Talk about the potential consequences for ordinary
There's
Americans.
a very easy way to show that. New York City put out a report under Mayor Bloomberg after Sandy, which I was one of the contributors to, which had a beautiful slide in it which showed the floods from the 10 greatest storms, the 10 greatest floods since 1950, the last 60 years basically. Then there's a line across the graph from your side which shows how high the water has to get to flood the New York City subway system.
Right.
9 of them missed by about a foot or two. The 10th one, Sandy, made it. And that means if sea level, which is projected to rise now in this city by perhaps as much as 2 feet by the 2050s, I'm not talking the distant future, I'm talking if you have young kids, they're in the prime of their lives then. By the 2050s, a couple of feet, that means that instead of a Sandy happening, it hadn't happened before that the subway system had been flooded from the sea. Now all of a sudden, it could happen once every 10 years, and then more frequently as we go in. And we almost lost the subway system on that flood. We got both a combination of the brilliant work of the workmen who knew what to do, but also it was largely luck that the salt water didn't sit there long enough to corrode the signal system, which would have shut down the system. A combination of brains and good luck and guts got us out of it. We can count, I think, on brains. We can count on guts from our workers, but we cannot count on good luck every time.
So we've been looking to infrastructure improvements in New York to try and mitigate the damage from future flooding events, terrible storms and that sort of thing. One, it's incredibly expensive, but two, will infrastructure really do the job?
Well, there are certain relatively cheap things that we should have done 20 years ago that we didn't do as we saw the sea level rising. Then there are things that are rather expensive, some of which we need to think about a little more, like building a surge barrier, like London has. Maybe we need it, maybe not. We want to refine our calculations and see how the global warming plays out for maybe another decade before we make that decision, because once you make that decision, it's tens of billions of dollars and has a lot of implications for the city. But there's a third path, which are things that are either soft infrastructure, enhancing wetlands, for instance, and building up the beaches, or they're small and relatively inexpensive infrastructure projects. And the city actually has plans to do that stuff. Temporary barriers that could be put up along the Hudson and East River that can be removed when a storm isn't threatening. Raising the bulkheads along the city. Making the sidewalks and pavement porous instead of hard so that floodwaters can drain through them instead of running off to the low point. These are all measures which are well understood, and by the way, one which we started and stopped doing, which I always am amazed at. You know how you walk on the sidewalks of the city and you see these gratings? Well, those are generally to allow air to circulate down into the subway. And you notice they're at street level. So what happens when there's a flood? The water goes down. So after a big flood about 5 years ago, Governor Spitzer, I think it was, ordered that those gratings be raised a few feet so that the subways wouldn't flood if we had a big flood from the sea. It happened to be a freshwater flood, that is a rainstorm that caused a flooding. Right. But it's the same principle. So you raise them up. Now they did it on 1 or 2 subway stations, I think, down near Wall Street, and then they stopped. But the city's risk is much higher than that. The floodwaters from another Sandy, and the risk of a storm like Sandy, which was a 1,000-year flood, it becomes, toward the end of the century, like a 10 or 20-year flood. It happens that often. We can't afford that. So what we have to do is like those obvious things, like build the gratings to a higher level. Some of that is being thought of. Some of it, I think, is actually being started. But the trouble with political systems is our leaders think about being reelected and they don't focus on the long-term issues. This time, we can't afford that attitude. They really need the focus.
One of the things that was brought into sharp relief with Sandy were all the homes that are built on or near the shoreline in New York City and in the
Oh, yes.
metropolitan area, down in New Jersey, on Long Island, and that sort of thing. In terms of public policy, what should we be thinking about homes built, homes that are going to be vulnerable to these kinds of storms that we think are going to be increasing as we move forward?
Well, we should think twice as individuals about buying a home that's very close to sea level, because although there's still a willingness on the part of the federal government to partly subsidize flood insurance, that's not going to be the way it is for very much longer. And they've already strengthened the system to make the rates come closer to market rates. And you're simply not going to be able to afford to build smack along the coast. So that's one thing. The other thing is we should demand, a lot of this problem is about leadership. Leadership from the president, leadership from the mayor, leadership from the governor. We should be demanding from our leaders that they start the long-term plans and implementing them so that we're not caught out. I mean, people died during Sandy.
Right.
That's horrible. It shouldn't have been allowed to happen. It didn't have to happen. If we had planned and as a community come together to do the things that are obvious and necessary, we could have saved lives, saved damages, saved a lot of money, and put the city on a better course for the future. But I'm worried now that the new administration, which I generally think is trying to do a good job, on this one issue, I think their attitude is that was Bloomberg's thing. He was worried about global warming. He was worried about resilience. That's second rate as far as we're concerned. That attitude has to change.
Right. How did you first become interested in climate change?
I read about climate change in the late 1960s. That's how old I am. When I was in graduate school in a scientific journal, and I got really worried about it. And then so what, I worried, I don't know, I'm like everybody else, what am I going to do about it? So I forgot about it. And then I was an astrophysicist for a long time, and then I decided I wanted to do something more politically oriented. So I started getting involved in activism and research on problems related to the environment, particularly the atmosphere. And as I did that, I realized that global warming was the granddaddy of all problems, and we just had to solve it. So I've dedicated my career since then, whether I was at the Environmental Defense Fund, where I was an advocate scientist, or at Princeton University, where I'm a research scientist, to solving the problem.
Now, you're not just a scientist. I mean, you're an inhabitant of this planet. You have a family. When you see the things that are occurring now related to climate change, global warming, and you see the attitude of our government leaders, the naysayers, the media, which I think have not covered this the way it should have been covered, how do you feel about it personally, separate and apart from being a scientist?
You know, I have to admit that in order to be able to work on it professionally, I do a little bit of a split brain, and I try not to bring it home, frankly.
Right.
Of course, my children hear about it anyway, and they know about it, and they're very socially conscious, and maybe they'll go off and do a better job than we did at solving the problem.
Right.
But so I just try to keep my nose on what's in front of me, and what's in front of me is, both some very bad stuff, namely the Earth is warming and we don't have a grand plan for stopping it, but some good stuff. We shouldn't get all completely powerlessly depressed about this. For instance, President Obama has made it quite clear that he takes this seriously as part of his legacy. So he's tried to step over the Congress, which is doing nothing, and instead using all the powers that the president has already in existing law, rather than asking for new laws, and developing regulations which are starting to make a profound difference on U.S. emissions. Emissions of the so-called greenhouse gases that cause the warming are down. They're down significantly. They're headed down further. And the administration is implementing yet another set of regulations this summer, which are going to drive them down even further. Regulations on what electric power plants emit, regulations on what automobiles emit. But the center of the problem, the big part of it, is coal burning. And most of the coal burning now and in the future is coming out of places like China. And China is a real problem from this point of view. The Chinese government realizes that it has tremendous exposure to the harms of climate change, but they're still very obsessed with developing their economy as fast as possible to maintain political stability, among other things. And that has caused them to be too reliant on coal. There is some hope. The Chinese have produced an amazing revolution in the renewable energy market, that is solar energy and wind energy. They've driven the price down and sold it to the rest of the world. Now we'd like to see them use it themselves. They made a deal with the Russians to buy a huge amount of natural gas maybe that'll displace coal. Natural gas emits less less carbon dioxide. Of course, if you don't treat it right, it leaks into the atmosphere, and it itself is a greenhouse gas, so it's not a panacea. But there are hints here and there of places, cities, states, and even countries that are starting to grapple with it. So I don't give up. I'm not depressed. We can do this.
I want to talk a little bit about the coral reefs. You talked to me about that more than a decade
Yes.
ago, and they're sometimes known as the rainforests of the oceans. Why is that, and what's been happening to them?
Well, and you wrote a good column on this, I remember,
you.
quite some time ago. Coral reefs are a densely populated, beautiful ecosystem. I don't know how many of the viewers have seen it, but they're just gorgeous, multicolored, rich with fish and other living things. But they happen to be very sensitive to even slight warming. So a warming of, say, 2 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Fahrenheit is enough to basically start knocking them back and eventually destroy them. And that level of warming is perilously close. And if we don't start acting soon, this ecosystem, which isn't just a matter of aesthetics, people, a lot of people go there for vacations. Well, that's money in the hands of people who would otherwise be poor, who are providing the services. They are nurseries for fishing, parts of the fishing industry. If that goes, some of people's diets in those countries go. So this is a globally important ecosystem in the tropics. And unfortunately, the future, this is one of those things which I cannot be optimistic about, because I think the chances of us stopping the warming short of undermining the coral reef system are small at this point. We waited much too long.
Right. In our final few minutes, let's take a look at what we should be doing. Some recommendations from you in terms of public policy, and then what can ordinary individual Americans be doing about global warming?
So let me give you the big vision. The big vision is that 75, 100 years from now, coal is gone, most of the natural gas is gone, oil is gone. What we're doing is providing energy by solar photovoltaic cells, converting some of that energy from electricity into hydrogen gas by electrolyzing water, piping that gas around just like we do natural gas, and powering cars with what are called fuel cells, which are gas-powered batteries, or burning the hydrogen in industrial production, and again using the electricity from the cells into the grid. That's a vision a lot of people have had. I didn't invent it. I think it's good and likely to happen in the future. The question is, how do we get from here to there? And you don't make a jump in one fell swoop. You do it incrementally until the increments all of a sudden accelerate. And it looks like we're headed in that direction because the cost of solar cells has fallen by a factor of about 4 in the last 10 years, again, because the Chinese went to mass production. We're seeing cheaply available natural gas now, which helps as a bridge. And if we can organize a political system to stop subsidizing fossil fuels and instead shift the incentives to renewable energy, I think that'll be enough of the final push to get us over the hump and get us in the right direction. Now, the regulations that the administration has put in require that electric power plants can't just burn coal anymore, essentially is what they do. They require that automobiles have to get more fuel efficient. Higher fuel economy reduces carbon dioxide emissions. Everybody in their home, when you go out and buy a refrigerator, as I am getting a new one tomorrow because my old one stopped working, it should be, look at the yellow label. It should have the highest highest energy efficiency in the class that you need. When you buy a car, look at the size class, get the one that gets the highest fuel economy. That way you're making decisions that make a difference.
So we're not past the point of no return. Maybe we're close.
The way I put it is things could always get worse, but if we don't act now, it's going to get really bad.
Michael, this was great. I hope you'll come back again, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. I really appreciate your being here, and take care.
I'm always glad to come back. Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. President Obama's pick to head the Department of Housing and Urban Development is Julian Castro, the mayor of San Antonio, Texas. As soon as that became known, politicians and pundits began handicapping Castro's chances of being the Democratic vice presidential nominee in 2016. He's young, he's attractive, and he's Hispanic. A perfect choice to run with Hillary Clinton, or so they say. I think we need to rid ourselves of this obsession with presidential politics. As soon as we finish with one presidential election, we start speculating on the next race. It's an endless, pointless exercise. HUD secretary is a big job. America's cities are riddled with problems, crime, unemployment, and a chronic shortage of affordable housing. And poverty remains a plague on our society, especially poverty among children. Let's see what plans Julian Castro has for dealing with some of these monumental issues before we anoint him as a candidate for the second biggest job in the land. That's it for now. See you next time.